Noah Coburn has been at the center of the theme semester. He's been with us all term as a postdoctoral research fellow in Central Asian Studies and as a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology. His presence was supported by all of the sponsors of this theme semester. That's CREASE is one, also the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Center for South Asian Studies, and also the Islamic Studies program, and the Center for Chinese Studies too. And his presence has helped to make this theme semester possible. The idea was to bring in a real expert, someone who really knew Afghanistan and who could expose our students and the wider community to it. And that's just what he's done. He's taught for us a terrific course on the ethnography of an international intervention. I'm seeing a couple heads shake. I think we may have some familiar students in the room. That one, by the way, was oversubscribed, unlike my course back in '08. I won't take it personally, Noah. That's fine. He's run a terrific teacher workshop for K-12 schools in the area and continued his own scholarly work as well, in addition to being on the staff as a consultant and researcher for the United States Institutes of Peace and its program in Afghanistan, that is specifically pursuing modes of conflict resolution and the pursuit of peace in Afghanistan in a range of provinces across the country. In fact, he spent his winter break going back to Afghanistan to do that. Dr. Coburn earned a PhD in anthropology at Boston University, where he worked with Tom Barfield, who, as you may or may not know, is one of the world's leading experts on Afghanistan. Before that, he studied at Columbia, where he earned his master's, and he earned that from Columbia's version of CREASE, in a way, the sort of area studies related to Russian, East European, Eurasian studies, with an emphasis on NGOs in Central Asia. And before that, he was educated at the college that produced the greatest Central Asianists of this generation, Williams College. And I'll let you guess why I framed it that way. Go Eves. He's a social anthropologist by training who really knows Afghanistan through time in Afghanistan. That is, time with Afghans on the ground, coming to know it intimately. Most of his work is in Dari, that's Persian, although he knows some Pashto as well, and he'll be talking about the details of that work in a moment, so I won't give away his thunder. I just want you to note one thing before I turn over the podium to him. That is, how do things look different when they're put into that kind of locally, richly contextualized vein? How does one's stereotypes undergo shift? How might commentators, bureaucrats, diplomats, or politicians sitting in places comfortable and far away see things about peace, security, stability, and instability differently if informed by a detailed understanding of the particularities of places around the world? Amid warfare, Dr. Coburn has found places where economic interactions, in particular, can produce localized forms of security and even prosperity through work with potters in one particular place in Afghanistan. He'll talk more about that in the talk today. You can see the title up on the screen. You can read more about it after today, if you wish, in his book, out soon, August, this summer, from Stanford University Press, Bazaar Politics, Potters and Power in an Afghan Market Town. Dr. Coburn.
That all right on the lights? Well, thanks, Doug, and thanks to CREASE for organizing this event, and thanks to the International Institute and the Anthropology Department, which really enabled me to be here this semester, which has been a terrific opportunity. As Doug pointed out, I've spent a good time in Afghanistan, but I haven't had much of an opportunity to step back and think about what some of these issues mean with a little more distance, with a little more space. So this semester, I've spent a lot of time writing and thinking and trying to draw some of these thoughts together. And as you know, this talk was rescheduled from February, so because I've been thinking and writing, I've moved on to some other issues. So I'm going to change my talk slightly, which is why it's now Potters and Warlords and Elections in an Afghan bazaar. But I want to do a couple things today. And the first thing I want to do, in attending a lot of the talks about Afghanistan, I want to try to move us away from some of the stock narratives that keep popping up. Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires, Afghanistan as governed by unruly tribes, but also Afghanistan and Afghans as victims of the Taliban, victims of the Soviet Union, victims now of Americans, perhaps. And what I see the situation in reality is being much more the result of how individuals are making political decisions. Decisions within a context that, yes, is currently unstable and in flux, but one where individuals still have real agency. So I want to describe what first brought me to elections in Afghanistan. I spent my first 18 months in Afghanistan doing field research in a small town about a year after elections occurred. So a lot of my initial thoughts were people talking about what had happened in those elections the year before. And this is the town of Istalif. You can see it's in the foothills of the Hindu Kush there. It's a fairly wealthy area. There's a lot of agriculture. Historically, it's a politically powerful district, which makes it particularly interesting for me. And there's a large craft-based economy. And the result of this is that socially and economically speaking, guilds that are formed around patrilineal lineages have real power in the town. The area was conservative, and local elders tended to maintain their importance and could mobilize forcefully. Yet the year before my arrival, there had been several popular candidates in the parliamentary elections, the Warlords it's called, I'll refer to it, which is the lower but the most important house in the Afghan parliament. Yet none of the three very popular candidates were able to gather enough votes to win a seat in the Warlords. Why had they not been able to do that? And this was a topic of quite a bit of discussion in town. But what I was doing was primarily living and working with a series of potters. And the potters were one of the more influential groups in town. You can see they gathered the clay up in the hills above town. And pottery is a fairly labor-intensive process. A lot of it takes place here, the preparation of the clay, the cleaning of the clay. It's not very high-quality clay, so that takes some work. And then once they start working on the wheels, you can see in these pictures right here, this is actually doesn't take up too much of the time in terms of pottery production. But all of these steps, particularly when they're on the wheels, require a certain level of cooperation. It's much easier to work on the wheel when you have your younger brother cleaning the clay and preparing it for you. You can see here's the kiln over here. The kilns are large updraft kilns. They're about 15 feet high, perhaps. And it's much easier when you have a man climbing down into the kiln and being handed down pots. So the potters tended to stay together as families even after the death of their father, which wasn't something that you typically found in other groups in the area. And this is one of the things that gave them a certain amount of social cohesion, which eventually translated into political cohesion, making them quite an important group in the town. There's a respect for elders and older brothers, but also a constant incentive to look outside for other forms of alliances, for other forms of income, particularly for young men looking to get married. Marriage is very costly. It costs quite a bit of money, and you need to be able to rely on outside sources of income if you really want to do that. This meant that these social and economic patterns meant that power was always limited to a certain extent. Older brothers tended to control economic resources of the family, but acting too dictatorially might encourage a younger brother to leave the household. Similarly, the head potter, the Malik, his power had similar limits to it. So here's my friend Malik Abdul Salam. He's essentially the leader of the potters. But the position of the Malik, as with all positions in Afghanistan, including the kings, tends to be patrilineally inherited, but this isn't necessarily a strict rule. So the community would point out constantly to me that if his eldest son was considered too selfish and not an effective leader, they would choose somebody else. And so here's his eldest son here, Abdul Manan, who will probably become the next Malik. But because there was this check on his power, the community always forced him to act in certain ways and to continue to project an air of authority in certain ways. And you can see here, this is the Malik's oldest son, this is his second oldest son, here's the third, Abdul Mateen, the fourth is right there. And you'll notice Abdul Mateen doesn't have a beard, which was quite rare and a little risque in Istalif. Almost all the men had beards. But he could get away with that because he was the third son. Abdul Manan couldn't have done that. That would have been a little too controversial, probably. These definitions of authority meant that leaders were important, yes, but their power was always kept in check by the ability of the group to revoke that authority if they chose to. This, along with patterns of marriage, intermarriage between families, created significant group cohesion and the ability to mobilize politically that ultimately decreased the likelihood of violence, which is really the focus of that book that I have coming out in August. However, it also meant that while elders had certain influence, the threat of the group breaking apart ultimately limited what they could and could not do. This in turn played out between the groups in town almost as much as it did within the groups. So while there's a great number of local political actors, many of whom receive their political legitimacy from very different sources, there's a common understanding that direct conflict would threaten the balance in town between various leaders. And I've got some of them up here. Here's Sufi Razak, he's the chief warlord in town. This is the Malawi, the chief religious figure. Here's his assistant. That's the district commander. There's a militia leader. This is a group of tribal elders. And similarly, they all controlled these groups that threatened to break apart at certain times, which meant even for a figure like a warlord in Istalif, he had certain responsibilities to give certain resources back, or else he was going to lose that loyalty of his men. So what did this mean for elections in Afghanistan? Well, elections in Afghanistan, and here I'm going to talk first about the 2005 election, which is what I came in just after, but then I'll refer to the 2009 elections, which were presidential and provincial council, and the 2010, which was parliamentary, which I've been doing research on more recently. But all of these elections are based on what's called the SNTV system, single non-transferable vote. So to elect a parliamentarian in Kabul, there's essentially a list, and in the last one, there were 600 candidates on the ballot. So this is 2 pages of a 12-page ballot. The ballot keeps going. It's a magazine, essentially. This type of system, each person gets 1 vote. You choose 1 candidate. The votes get tallied up, and the top 33 of those 650 or so win seats. This has a series of consequences. This type of system really undermines the formation of political parties. Political parties aren't very important in this type of system here. It also increases the number of candidates to even higher levels, and the margin of victory can be quite small. There's sometimes 10 votes separating a successful candidate from an unsuccessful candidate, and in certain provinces, even the top vote getter got 3 to 4% of the vote. That wasn't quite as true in Kabul, where you had a few former commanders who were quite influential. So in Istalif in 2005, there were 3 candidates of the more or less 600 there who were from Istalif. But Istalif's a fairly sizable, historically powerful community. So Istalifis had some right to expect that one of their candidates should probably be one of the 33 who make it in. Yet in 2005, local elders refused to compromise and instead worked to undermine all the candidates. They did this, it seemed, because there's a sense that if one candidate won, that might undermine the town's precarious balance, the truce that they had worked out between the different groups. The town's 3 main commanders all supported different candidates, as did the religious leaders, but none of them supported the candidates very vocally. Because if the candidate lost and you had supported the candidate in a political system which puts a high premium on honor, this would then threaten the reputation of anyone who had supported that candidate as well. So the result is, while in 2005 there's a great deal of excitement around the elections, none of the candidates were actually able to mobilize enough votes to win in Istalif. This contrasted with Karabagh, the district just next door, where there is actually much more open and violent political confrontation between different groups. However, in this case, leaders were able to negotiate between candidates, convincing certain candidates to step down, partially because the battle lines on certain issues in that district were already drawn. And this eventually ensured that they've had a successful candidate in all of the last 3 elections. So I returned to Boston to begin the write-up process of my dissertation. And as these issues began to play out in the run-up to the presidential and provincial council elections, it was simply too much to stay away. So I returned to then do follow-up research in Istalif and elsewhere on these issues. But this work, I expanded. My first initial ethnography is very focused just on Istalif. Since then, I've been working, sorry, this keeps jumping ahead for some reason. Since then, I teamed up with a British political scientist, actually, and a team of about 10 Afghan social scientists, primarily with sociology backgrounds. And we chose 6 different districts, Istalif being one of them, 2 in Kabul, 2 in Balkh, 2 in Paktia, to try to get a sense of how local politics were playing out in these elections. And we chose them because they represented different ethnic groups. The districts in Paktia were mostly Pashtun. One in Balkh was very mixed. Another one in Balkh was sort of an oddity. It's one of the very few Turkmen communities in Afghanistan. But also a range of security conditions. There was quite a bit of insurgency in Paktia, not enough to shut down all the polling stations, but a lot of the polling stations were closed, whereas Istalif was considered much more stable. But working with a political scientist raised some issues for me, particularly when we sat down to discuss methodology. And we found ourselves talking with our Afghan researchers about really what are elections. And in our work, one of the things we tried to do is walk that line between political science and anthropology, but we found ourselves a little frustrated by both. Anthropology really hasn't done that much on elections, with the exception of Hertzfeld and a few other interesting case studies, which is unfortunate because I think elections provide a fascinating opportunity to look at symbolism, ritual, and power within political processes. Yet the focus on institutions, rules, seems to have chased off many anthropologists. In the meantime, we found ourselves limited in political science by the focus on procedures and winners and losers, which is also language that the policymakers will see take up very much as well. So a typical definition of an election that we struggled with was a formal decision-making process during which a population chooses an individual to hold public office. While moving away from direct participation of citizens in decision-making, as took place in the Athenian models of the democratic processes, most elections in the current context still claim to facilitate representation of the population by the individual. However, I'm not always sure this dichotomy is as clear as we'd like it to be. And then this is assigned representative responsibilities to a public office, which has certain amounts of institutional authority. Our methodology didn't necessarily accept these premises. Instead of a discrete event, I think it's more useful to look at elections as embedded in local political landscapes. The disputes over land and other resources in Istalif were a part of conversations and conflict during campaigning, during the voting, and in the aftermath of recent elections. This suggests to me that elections are structuring structures in Bourdieu's sense of the term. That is, yes, elections are shaped by the political landscape, but they ultimately reshape how politics are being performed. The main focus on winners and losers in elections misses some key points. Particularly in Afghanistan, this dichotomy between state and non-state actors simply doesn't work for me. Hamid Karzai, for example, is, yes, the president of Afghanistan, but much of his authority comes from being a Populzai tribal leader. Similarly, warlords often have government positions, and even titles such as general are often applied to those who may or may not be in the government. There's very few political government figures in Afghanistan today who don't have some form of tribal or religious authority as well. And I would argue there's very few figures who are not government officials who don't have some connection to the government through certain patronage networks. So this led us to a methodology that was very different than some of the others who studied elections in Afghanistan. And instead of focusing on the election itself, we focused on the local conflicts over access to economic and political resources and the way this plays out in the long build-up to and aftermath from this recent series of elections. So what are some of the lessons that we've taken away at this point? Well, first of all, the international press very much focused on the presidential election of 2009 as being a key event in Afghanistan. And we found that Afghans we talked to didn't see this as very important. They're much more interested in the Wolasi-Jirga and the provincial council elections. The Karzai election they saw as a foregone conclusion. Once Karzai, if you'll remember, in the first round of voting, didn't make the 50% threshold he needed to. So there's quite a bit of consternation about a runoff that was then going to be held between him and Abdullah. There's a lot of conversations around the U.S. Embassy, around sort of policy groups about how this would work. And ultimately, Abdullah stepped down, and the runoff was canceled. And there was questions about whether this was constitutional or not. So we went around and talked to some Afghans voters that we had talked to beforehand and had traced through these elections. And their answer was they didn't really care. They saw Karzai as probably headed towards victory, and the procedural aspects of it simply weren't as important to them. However, for both the provincial council and the Wolasi-Jirga, Afghan communities are oftentimes very isolated from Kabul, very isolated from those central nodes of patronage. So electing a Wolasi-Jirga member, a provincial council member, is one of the few ways of creating a direct tie between a community and that government in Kabul. Similarly, Wolasi-Jirga members are often very good at accessing international funds, accessing NGOs. So successfully electing somebody to the Wolasi-Jirga gives a community access to significant alternative forms of funds, which include these large patronage networks centered around warlords like Marshal Fahim, the current vice president, Dostum, and figures like that, who might have geographically based areas of control, but still all have some tie back to Kabul. This creates a certain politics of accessing Kabul. The way in which a candidate can show themselves to have abilities to access Kabul then becomes a major way that they frame their campaigns. So one of the interesting cases we saw of this was in Karabakh, the district I've been referring to. Recently, a irrigation canal system had been that had been built in the 70s but had fallen into disrepair. Had been refurbished, and water was brought in from Charikar, the district to the north, and brought into Karabakh and then shared among the farmers. We went in, we did some questioning about how this had happened, and one of the fascinating things was in, I would say, the first 20 interviews we did on this project, we heard 20 completely different stories. Who had done what? Who was responsible for this? Who had gotten the funds? Who had helped distribute the water? Who had done all the political negotiations? And really what you hear in these stories is a description of how that person envisions the political system in Karabakh. So the result was, for one man who is particularly good at framing his role in distributing water, he hadn't gotten the money from the international community, but he had helped allocate water once it reached Karabakh. He established quite a bit of political capital doing this, which ultimately got him a seat in the provincial council. However, he wasn't the only candidate who was trying to do this. There's about 5 or 6 other ones who had similarly been involved, but perhaps weren't as convincing when they tried to tell this story. The other interesting thing we find when we look at elections in Afghanistan, elections are not necessarily about winning and losing. Voting can do several things. Remember, Afghanistan hasn't had a census, and there's a lot of political power in the number of people that live in certain districts and that live in certain provinces, but mostly we just have guesses of how many people live there. Local elders picking up on this have been encouraging voters to come out, not just to support certain candidates, but simply to vote so that they can then get the number of votes per district higher. Because if you have a lot of votes in your district, you can then go to the Afghan government, you can then go to NGOs and say, look at how high our population is. You should invest your development resources here. And not only is our population quite high, but we're a politically mobile, politically active district, so bring your projects here. On a more individual level, voting demonstrates a certain amount of loyalty. So on the election day in 2009, I visited some polling stations in Kabul and Karabakh, but eventually spent most of the day in Istalif at the main voting station, which I'll show a picture of in a second. And the main voting station in Istalif is meant only for those that live in sort of the center of Istalif, which is a fairly small population. But people were coming and hiking from 4 hours, from villages 4 hours up into the mountains to vote in Istalif, walking past several other polling stations on their way. And what this was local elders and local community leaders were basically gathered outside of the polling stations. So by publicly voting in the main voting station, you were demonstrating your loyalty to those leaders there. And the leaders, for their part, closely monitored the situation. One of my friends who is a Malik was sitting outside with several other Maliks drinking tea and sort of nonchalantly said, well, I'm going home for lunch, goodbye. And he wanders off, and at that moment almost, his oldest son walks in, who then sat there for about 2 hours before then he walks off to be replaced by the second oldest son. And again, it was this sort of monitoring process of them making sure they knew everybody from their community who had and had not voted. Elections are also very much a part of other processes, which is one of the reasons why it's not simply about winning and losing. Particularly when you have over 600 candidates for 33 seats, you have a large number of candidates who are quite open about the fact that they didn't expect to win. For example, in Karabakh, one man was running for office who I spoke with, who cut to the chase quite quickly and said, listen, I'm not planning on winning at all. I have a land feud with my cousin, and my cousin is running for public office. And if he wins and I lose, this will be very bad for me, and he might be able to reclaim this land with his new political power. But all I need to do is run, and that will ensure that my family's vote will be divided in half, and that makes sure that my cousin won't win the seat. Which is also, he was unsurprisingly Pashtun. This is a very Pashtun thing to say as well. But we also had other candidates who were quite open about the fact that running for parliament made their name bigger, as they would say. This is a way of sort of gaining fame within the community. And as another one would tell you, it also makes your application for an NGO job later quite appealing. If you are a failed provincial council candidate, this, particularly for the international community, sounds quite nice. Of course, most people in the international community who are hiring aren't paying attention to the fact that there's 5,000 failed candidates out there. So a lot of these local struggles simply sort of flow into elections as the elections flow into local struggles. So one of the reasons I really like this picture here is what you have is this is the election official in a voting station that's in a school, and the school's just off to the side here. And this is one of the local Maliks in the area. And they're having a debate right now about whether these men out here should be allowed in to monitor. They had been sitting outside right here. That's the same polling station. So they're now debating over whether the community should be allowed to monitor this situation or whether it's really the polling station monitor's job to monitor the situation. And then here's the chief of police, and I think his stance is very revealing. He's undecided at the moment. He's listening to both sides. Just because this guy is a government official doesn't mean that the police is going to take his side. And ultimately, a compromise was reached, and certain members were allowed in, but they had to leave all their weapons outside. Here's another good picture. This is the area where I was telling you about the Malik who is monitoring the situation. And again, it's very informal, but there's a lot of performance going on. This figure here in white is the main commander who I showed you before. This guy to his right is his right-hand man, who's an important businessman. These are two local Maliks. They've got the turban right there is the potter, the Malik of the potters. They're again greeting him as he's going around from polling station to polling station. And you can see these are sort of lower level elders who aren't Maliks and aren't quite on that level there, but they're trying to stay on the edge of the conversation to show some loyalty as well. But these conflicts lead to certain strategies within elections. So one of the obvious ones, which is discussed quite often in the media, is the buying and selling of votes. Elders and communities both work in order to sell their votes and their support, oftentimes to multiple candidates. So a community will approach several different candidates and try to see what is basically being offered from that candidate for their votes. But this isn't simply some tribal historical leftover. These are evolving dynamic processes. So one of the fascinating things we found in the 2009 elections, quite often elders and communities were successful at selling their votes to multiple candidates. And then candidates complain that I paid this elder for 500 votes and he didn't give me his votes. So in the 2010 elections, and this was only in the Southeast, so I wonder if this will spread to the rest of the country by the end. In the 2010 elections, the UN, which is promoting transparency in elections, is now hanging up all the results at each polling station. So if you vote in a place, the results are counted there and hung up there, as opposed to being taken just to Kabul and being tallied in Kabul. The interesting thing this enabled candidates to do is a candidate and an elder would go to a money changer in the Bazaar, and they would write up a formal contract, and the candidate would give the money changer a sum of money, say $500 for 500 votes, which is about a good price for votes, and the contract. And the money changer would then hold the money essentially in escrow until the results were in. And then the money changer could come to the polling station, which are located, are very geographically specific, and could basically check to see whether that elder had delivered the promised votes or not. If the elder had promised the votes, the money changer gave the money to the elder. If the elder had not delivered the promised votes, the money went back to the candidate. So we can see these sort of processes changing and adapting to the system. I contrasted this at a talk at the British Embassy, where they've got some funding for new voter education campaigns that they want to start thinking about. And the UN voter education posters are exactly the same ones that they used in 2004, 2005, 2009, and 2010. And it basically is sort of a picture of somebody folding a ballot and putting it in a box. And it's all very sort of basic, simple stuff. And Afghans have now voted 4 times in the past 9 years. They know how to put it in the box. But it's a great example of sort of the UN and their contracting methods being incredibly static, whereas the candidates and the communities themselves are actually being very effective at sort of responding to the way that different the election techniques are changing. Now, the interesting thing in a lot of the interpretation of particularly the presidential election, but also the massive amounts of fraud in this recent parliamentary elections, where it's assumed that approximately 1 million out of 5 million votes were cast fraudulently. It's an incredible amount. I mean, that's a fraud on an industrial scale. But the story is this delegitimizes the Karzai's government, which is commonly how it's perceived in the international media. And really, in terms of voters I spoke with being concerned about the elections, oftentimes their concern was not the delegitimizing of the Karzai government. Instead, what they were much more concerned about was when certain mobilization techniques failed. So what do I mean by this? Well, an interesting example is corruption, for example, is not always perceived as a negative trait in a candidate. If you're a candidate who can go to Kabul and buy a large number of votes, either with money or with political influence, well, that's evidence that you're something of a politically connected elite. And if I'm living in a small community, I want a representative who can go to Kabul and can play that game and who can manipulate that structure. So in some instances, corruption's actually seen as quite a good trait for a candidate to have, which in turn generates more political capital for that candidate. One of the things I was most amazed by, though, in the 2010 elections, and what generated a large amount of frustration in communities, was how spectacularly bad individual voters were at predicting who is going to win. And what I mean by that is not who I want to win, but who I think is going to win. And you would think in an American election, we should, with a fairly consistent rate, be able to predict who we think might win. Sure, not 100, but we should have a sense for what that's going to look like. Across the board, Afghans were very poor at actually predicting who the winner was. And the best example of this, and this applies to different types of candidates as well. So the best example I saw of this was in Paktia. And in Paktia, there's not that many candidates, so it's much less confusing than Kabul. There's probably about 30 candidates. And there's one incumbent named Pachahan Zadran, who's a well-known mid-level warlord. He's the most important of the Zadran tribe in Afghanistan. And of course, more Zadrans live in Pakistan, and they make up the backbone of the Haqqani network. So Pachahan Zadran's a very important figure for the coalition forces, because he actually fought originally against the coalition forces, but then came into the Karzai government. And if he goes back to the insurgent side, essentially all of the Zadrans will be on the insurgent side because of the Haqqani network. So he's this sort of pivotal warlord figure. And across the board, when we talked to voters in Paktia, almost everyone said, oh, of course, Pachahan, he will win again. He's got tribal support, he's got money, he's got the threat of violence. If anybody can pull off the corruption, he can as well. But they mentioned someone else too. So the number one candidate they thought would win is Pachahan Zadran. They didn't necessarily like him, but they thought he would win. The other candidate was a woman named Sharifa Zormati, who's a former BBC reporter, also an incumbent. Didn't have quite the same tribal connections, though she's from Zormat, which is still a important tribal area. But the real reason voters liked her was she had been extremely creative in providing resources with very limited economic capital. So she had set up a program to clean the Bazaar in Gardez, where certain men would donate their labor, and she bought all the supplies. She had run a Pashtun poetry contest, which was wildly popular down there, which probably cost her a couple $100s, but it was one of these things that the entire community came out for. And she also had been quite successful at getting credit for bringing a women's hospital down to Paktia. And for candidates, establishing women's hospitals is quite an effective form of campaigning, because women, of course, are difficult to reach in the homes. So oftentimes the thought is women just vote how their husbands do, unless they go to some place like a clinic, which then is associated with a certain candidate. So that's at least the rhetoric around women's votings in a lot of these cases. Now, to almost everybody's surprise, both Sharifa Zormati and Pachahan Zadran lost. And they actually lost quite badly. They came up quite a ways down on the list. And there's a series of reasons why they lost. Pachahan Zadran suffered from the fact that due to insecurity, a lot of polling stations in his area had been shut down. Sharifa Zormati had some similar problems. There were certainly some other candidates in the area that were able to buy enough votes to pass them. But this people found much more galling than the fact that their favorite candidate didn't win. The fact that the system was so difficult to see into, and they basically became convinced that everything that's going on is basically closed-door negotiations to which your average citizen has no access. And for them, it's not the corruption so much as it's the inability to see how the corruption works, the inability to play the corruption game as well. International interest in the elections, in the media in particular, tended to be a little bit surprised by, I think, the level of corruption and the level of violence in the last couple of elections. Yet, to me, when we see elections as part of a wider political struggle, their presence becomes somewhat less surprising. Elections are a venue for both individuals and communities to demonstrate their power. This is particularly important in a context like Afghanistan today, where instability and political ambiguity are deeply embedded in political systems. But if elections are ways to demonstrate power, so too is both corruption and violence. that example I told you of a candidate who had access to corrupt links in Kabul is a way of demonstrating that power. Violence as well is simply a different form of power that when we think of elections not as isolated winning and losing events, we can see more of it along the spectrum, along a similar spectrum. So on the road to Istalif, approximately 2 weeks after the elections, the results were announced in stages. It was partial results, and final results didn't come out for several months. But quite concerningly, several weeks after the elections, 2 roadside bombs went off on the way to Istalif, where I'd initially done my research. This was quite worrying because my friends live there. It was also quite worrying because I just defended a dissertation about why Istalif wasn't violent. So had to go find out what happened. And the intriguing thing about it was there had been 2 roadside bombs. And as we started doing interviews, it turned out they went off at 10 p.m. Not only did they go off at 10 p.m., but they were in a ravine underneath a bridge. And they're pretty deep in the ravine, and they cracked the pavement of the bridge, but they hadn't even taken out the bridge. And it was a little difficult to tell, but certainly they hadn't been trying to kill anybody because nobody's out on the streets at 10. And it was a little difficult to tell if they were even meant to take out the bridge. So we did some follow-up on all of this, and what it turns out happened, there were 2 stories. The bombs went off in an area that was very loyal to Hizb Islami, the group led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And several of his candidates in the area had done very poorly in the initial results. So there were two ideas about what was going on. The first theory was, well, these are people targeting these candidates who had failed, these dangerous Hizb Islami members. The other theory said that the candidates themselves had put the bombs into the ravine because by showing up so low on the list, that demonstrates a certain loss of political capital. They were in danger of losing honor and losing sort of their position in negotiations over all sorts of other things like land and water rights in the community. So by setting off the bombs, they're at least making themselves look like they're important enough to be targets of a bomb, which in turn gives them some political power there that they threaten to lose due to those initial poor showings. You get this on a much wider scale too. Governor Atta in Mazar-e-Sharif in Balkh is very much a old school Northern Alliance guy who fought against the Taliban and has deep personal hatred for the Taliban. And in the weeks leading up to the elections, you had these intriguing rumors coming out of Governor Atta facilitating Taliban attacks in Balkh. I mean, these are two groups that couldn't be on further ends of the political spectrum. But again, when you dig a little deeper, what you find out is that basically he had been turning a blind eye to attacks that were in communities where his opponents had a large amount of supporters. What then happened was the election committee, seeing these attacks, said, oh, this community is too violent to have a polling station in. I better shut this polling station down. So Governor Atta basically was able to, by teaming up with the Taliban momentarily, to shut down all the polling stations in the major areas where his rivals had large numbers of supporters, ensuring that all of the representatives from Balkh were firmly on his team, as it were. And finally, to return to the case of Pacha Zadran, the leader from Paktia who I was telling you about, almost immediately after the election, he went on TV in a typical Afghan news talk show and spoke using the vaguest of terms about these elections being illegitimate and about returning to his brothers in the mountains. And of course, Karzai referred to the Taliban as his brothers about a year ago, so there's certain reference to that language right there. And in the meantime, the international troops, particularly ISAF, don't want to see Pacha Hanzadran return to the mountains either, because they're concerned about him joining back up with the Haqqani network. So already there's been negotiations between Pacha Hanzadran and Karzai's first wife's brother. Again, it all comes down to kinship. Karzai's first wife's brother, who's friends with Pacha Hanzadran, they're essentially negotiating him a government position. So that he will not be on the outside of the government due to this failure. But basically, his ability to continue to threaten violence ensures that even in losing the election, and there's been some rumor that he may be Deputy Minister of the Interior, which is actually, I think, probably a better position than a parliamentarian, that he's actually been able to use the threat of him leaving to secure even more political capital than he would have had otherwise. In particular, figures like Pacha Hanzadran have been the most successful in these recent elections. It's those who have access to violence, those who have significant funds from legal and illegal sources that continue to tighten their grasp on political power in Afghanistan nationally. While anthropology has done some interesting work on different definitions of democracy, which we probably don't have enough time to go into here, it's clear that with whatever definition of democracy, except for one that simply equates elections and democracy, that these recent elections in Afghanistan appear to have moved Afghanistan further away from democracy. This is particularly true when we consider democracy more as the ability of the average individual to access political and economic resources on an even playing field. Returning to the Istalif case for a second, we see a system that was in many ways democratic turning less so. While certain elders may dominate the system, there is also a series of checks and balances that in some ways guaranteed young men in particular the ability to influence the political hierarchy and to ensure that their concerns were being represented. More worrying is the fact that by looking at elections as isolated events, we miss the more long-term damage that they can potentially cause. Bourdieu's structuring structures shape not just politics today, but in how an entirely new generation of Afghans are being socialized politically and shaping their expectations and their performance within a specific political system, which is currently being dominated by these figures. Looking at the way in which elections are embedded in a society's political culture, I'm hesitant to make too many policy recommendations, but I do think our story has some clear morals, so let's make at least some general conclusions along those lines. These recent elections can't simply be dismissed as corrupt and then addressed through a series of technical reforms. The failures of these elections have nothing to do with simply the rules of the game and how ballots are designed. They've further solidified a group of powerful former warlords who often rely on dangerous ethnic rhetoric to mobilize followers. The result is that elections have, if anything, increased the distance between citizens and the government, but also made it less likely that this distance will decrease anytime in the near to medium-term futures. The recent elections in Afghanistan, and indeed much of the current international intervention, even in those areas with minimal insurgent activities like Istalif, have done more harm than good ultimately. This is particularly true when we see elections as these structuring structures, allowing us to study not simply the question of whether a political body is representative or not, but how the political landscape both shapes and is then in turn reshaped by elections. These mechanisms have unfortunately largely been co-opted by a particularly nasty ruling elite, an elite who are simultaneously using development funds, being rearmed through NATO programs, and generally solidifying their positions in preparation for an eventual U.S. drawdown of troops. The result is that for many normal Afghans, particularly the young men who are at the center of my research, they actually have less access to political and economic resources than they did 5 years ago. Yet the international community still seems to assume that in any state-building process, elections are a necessary first step. Instead, I would argue that by perceiving elections more as mechanisms that take place within a certain political context, we see that the issues in that context, such as the continued rule of warlords, such as the corruption of government officials, should be addressed before attempts to hold elections simply because they are best practice in terms of development theory. More generally, the international community and the United States continues to try to make sharp turns in the politics of the countries in which they're intervening, such as recent negotiations with the Taliban, or at least rumors thereof. Ignoring the importance of political culture and the way that deep patterns shape political events, but also the way that these political events can come back to reshape these patterns, I think is a key that we're missing in all of this. Without such a more nuanced, culturally aware approach, international intervention threatens to continue to destabilize Afghanistan and the region. Thank you.